is the legislation that we call 21st Century Cures and the mental health legislation, both of which are being debated in the U.S. House of Representatives this afternoon and will be voted on this afternoon about 5:30. This is legislation that has the strong support of the President of the United States, the active support of the Vice President of the United States. Speaker Ryan in the House has said that it is an important part of his agenda for health care for the future. And the Majority Leader, Senator McConnell, has said he believes it's the most important piece of legislation Congress could enact this year. One reason it has been successful is because it has been so bipartisan in its making, both in the House and in the Senate. Let me begin by thanking President Obama and Vice President Biden for their strong support and their interest. The President's interest in precision medicine, the idea of personalized medicine, that if the senator from Pennsylvania and I each have the same disease, that we might not take exactly the same medicine because our genetics might be different. We now know enough about that if we can help doctors have that information, they can prescribe medicines that will help us to live longer. The President and the Executive Office of the President have issued a statement of administration policy that's one of the strongest that I have seen. I hope it persuades Republicans and I hope it persuades Democrats, both to be supportive of this legislation. I ask consent that following my remarks that the statement of administration policy be included in the congressional record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I mentioned the bipartisan nature of the legislation, and I'll give two examples of that, and there are two colleagues on the floor who I will ask to give the second example, which is the mental health bill. This has been complex, no doubt about that. I spoke at length on the floor yesterday about that, but I would ask my colleagues to recognize this, that the core of this legislation is the following: 19 different bills that went through the Senate's Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, 22 members of the Senate, after many hearings, and the largest number of recorded votes against any of those 19 bills was 2. Now, we have a very diverse committee. We have some of the most liberal members and some of the most conservative members, and on complex issue like this, we're able to work out 19 bills that are the core of this legislation, and the largest number of votes recorded against any of the 19 was 2. Secondly, every single one of those 19 bills had a Democratic sponsor and a Republican sponsor, usually more than one. And in addition to that, there is money attached to the bill. Now, that's very unusual because this is an authorization bill. But the House did it, and so we did it as well, recognizing the importance of this to the American people. And we did it in a fiscally responsible way. It's $6.3 billion that doesn't add a penny to the overall budget, because for every increase in the discretionary budget, we reduced the same amount in the mandatory budget. And what is the funding for? The funding is for, I have the exact figures right here, $4.8 billion for the National Institutes of Health for research in urgent matters, $1.8 billion for the cancer moonshot that the Vice President is leading, $1.4 billion for precision medicine, $1.6 billion for the brain initiative, including Alzheimer's, and then $1 billion for state grants to help states fight the opioid abuse epidemic. That money has been accelerated so that all of this $1 billion is spent in the first 2 years, and all of the cancer moonshot money is spent in the first 3 years. And Speaker Ryan arranged for this money in the following way. that while it has to be approved each year by the Appropriations Committee, it cannot be spent on anything other than this designation. So that $1 billion can only be spent on opioids abuse. I cannot imagine a House of Representatives that passes by an overwhelming vote the 21st Century Cures Bill not completing its promise to spend $1 billion on opioid this year and next year. And I cannot imagine the United States Senate, which I expect to also approve this by a large vote, doing the same. I also can't imagine Democrats and Republicans going home and explain why they would vote no on $1 billion of state grants for opioids money when we've been talking all year about what an urgent epidemic it is, or against $1.48 billion for a cancer moonshot when so many advances are being made, or against $1.4 billion for precision medicine when the president has made so eloquently the case of why it's important, or $1.6 billion for the Brain Initiative at a time when Dr. Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, tells us that we are near to medicines that will identify Alzheimer's before there are symptoms and permit us to retard its progression. Think of the grief that will save millions of families. Think of the billions of dollars that will save in our country. This bill has had the participation of dozens of members of the United States Senate, but none more effective and none more important than the senator from Louisiana, Senator Cassidy, and the senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy. They have taken the mental health bill, and even though they're both relatively new to the Senate, they have navigated landmines as if they had been here 25 years. They've worked across the aisle with each other, and they have worked with Democrats and Republicans in the House of Representatives to produce a bill that passed overwhelmingly in the House that will be added today by amendment. It's also been approved by our HELP committee here. And I thought it would be helpful today, Mr. President, and an example of the bipartisan support for the bill, to ask Senator Cassidy and Senator Murphy to describe the mental health bill. Senator McConnell says the 21st Century Cures Bill is the most important piece of legislation that Congress will pass this year. I believe that the mental health bill, which has 3 parts that we will enact this year, part from our committee and part from Judiciary, is the most significant piece of mental health legislation in terms of reforms of programs that the Congress will have passed in more than a decade.